Andrew Hill there, Associate Editor and Management Editor at Financial Times. Let me begin, I suppose, by asking that question. How are you doing? How are you coping with these peculiar times?
Well, I think reasonably well. I mean, of course, we are all now in our separate places, and everybody's place is different. And I'm lucky enough to have a house that's large enough to accommodate a family of four with separate places where they can each work, and a bit of outside space, and an opportunity to get out and exercise every day as well. And not everybody is in that situation. We were talking before we came on about a colleague of mine who has a house like mine, but just happened to be in the middle of a renovation and has found herself having to quarantine with her family of four in a small apartment where they expected to be renting until Easter and then returning to the family house. So everybody, through fate or their own position or their own background, has ended up in the place that they've ended up. And so I think it's worth acknowledging right at the beginning that there are very different experiences out there. And somebody's experience of being in a small apartment with no outside space and small children who need to be looked after at the same time as running a business or being part of a team is quite different from that of somebody else who's in solitary splendor with a large garden and lots of space to move around in. And I'm more in the latter category than the former, I'm glad to say. And actually, I'm finding it from a productivity point of view quite helpful. I mean, I have in the past worked from home when I've had a big piece to finish or where I need to get a little bit of peace and not be interrupted in the office. And so I've got some of the setup already here that I would use. I think it's much more difficult for colleagues of mine, for example, who are working on production of the print edition of the Financial Times, who have had to move to very small screens in their homes and don't have the same technological capability to work from home. And they've had to catch up. The FT's had to ship out screens and chairs and a lot of the equipment that they would have been used to in the office, so they at least try to be more comfortable at home.
So in terms of the way we manage and cope with this transition, there's that practical point you make there about the facilities in which we may live and the environment in which we may live, and also the job we have to do. Is there also a cultural aspect to the starting point? Some of us are joining this from a business culture that maybe remote working is already an easy thing, a business as usual thing. And some of us are maybe joining this altered reality from a perspective where this is a bigger leap.
Yeah, I think that's true. Obviously, in some cases, as I was saying, just to use that FT example, sub-editors who are used to working on large screens in the office close to each other, where a query can be answered by just a nod across the desk to the person that you work closely with, they are in a different situation from a more solitary writer or reporter or columnist like me, who works generally quite well on their own and will occasionally want to break off to socialize or to exchange views with colleagues, but where that sense of working very closely in a team is not quite as important. And so that makes a difference. And of course, again, to acknowledge again that there are people who simply can't work from home because their job involves hands-on operation of a machine or a type of work, delivery, whatever it may be, that they're just not unable to do so. So I think it does depend. And then beyond that, as you've suggested, there are clearly some companies that were used to, that were set up for working from home or already had the remote capability. Maybe they tested it out. Maybe they'd already had a culture of rotating people through home working or offering people the choice, and they would have been better prepared than those that have had to push everybody out. But I mean, let's be clear here. This was written about early on as a sort of experiment in flexible working, but as somebody who is used to flexible working and remote working told me in one of the very first weeks in the UK of lockdown, this is the reverse of flexible working. It's highly inflexible. Nobody's getting a choice really about whether to work at home or not. And that makes a huge difference, I think, to how people will emerge from this.
That's a very interesting point, isn't it? It's all right for us to celebrate the flexibility of working among our cats near our fridge, but you're right, we're actually in a situation that presents huge challenges. This is more inflexible. I definitely see what you mean. Broadening out from the FT and our worlds to all those companies you've been speaking to, you've been getting the insight from a broad range of business leaders recently, is that right?
Yes, I mean, we've been doing we've been talking to people every week, really, but we, that is me and my colleague Emma Jacobs at the FT, did a big dive 2 weeks ago into what some of the big companies and indeed workers at those companies were experiencing, including some multinationals like BP and Unilever and McKinsey that interestingly had also had experience of having to deal with this in China, Italy or Spain, where the coronavirus arrived sooner, and so therefore had longer experience of what it was like to have to work with everybody off-site.
Right. And if you were to sort of broadly give us a picture of what the biggest challenges have been among those various different organisations through different industries, what challenges are cropping up most frequently?
Well, I think there's a practical one, which I've hinted at in the FT's experience, which is when you know that you have to send everybody off to remote working, then you immediately have to kit them out. And so companies like Unilever, and there was another multinational company that I spoke to, were finding, for example, that they had to immediately find screens, laptops for people working, for example, in India, where they'd been used to bringing people in from their homes to a very well-equipped hub to work, and then discovered that they had to actually give these people the equipment to work from their homes. So that's one practical aspect. And then I think very quickly, and it was notable to me and perhaps heartening, that all the companies that we spoke to mentioned very quickly the well-being, the mental well-being aspect of working from home. All of them were conscious that prolonged home working, particularly forced home working, where you don't have the choice to go somewhere else, was going to have an effect on the mental health of the people that they were that were working for them. And so BP, for example, told me that they had very, very quickly rolled out, I think it was in the space of 10 days, they had done a deal with Headspace, which is one of the providers of mental well-being apps, to provide that for their whole workforce. So something would normally have taken weeks to set up contractually and to get everything rolled out. They had rolled out very quickly because they recognized that after a certain amount of time, people were going to need to have some guidance, which could no longer be provided in person, about how to retain work-life balance, if you like, when in fact your work and life have been slammed together.
I'm really pleased you've mentioned that there's this considerable technical limitations and challenges that we're faced by this situation, but also the health, the well-being, what we need as humans. And do you think, are most companies taking that side of it seriously? Is adequate provision being made to consider the mental health of our workforces?
I think the ones that we're talking to, and of course these companies like a McKinsey or a Unilever or a BP, they are big, well-equipped companies. Mm-hmm. They have the resources to be able to do that. Mm-hmm. But I think there is a much more sort of micro part of this. It's one thing rolling out an app to everybody or sending through tips about how to maintain your balance when you're at home, or allowing you free access to fitness classes or mindfulness sessions. I think it's another, and it goes back to this cultural point, to ensure that individual teams are run in a way that acknowledges the difficulties that others have. And everyone on this call, I suspect, is familiar with the way in which in the first week of lockdown, people rushed to use Zoom or Google Hangouts or Microsoft Teams, not only for video conferencing for work, but also to have hangouts with work friends, with colleagues, to have some way of venting what would normally be vented in the around the water cooler, if you like, or in the canteen, or in the sandwich bar down the way. Most companies did that, but a lot of it was down to the initiative of teams and team members to get together. And I think, one of the things that is very hard to gauge is the extent to which individuals are paying attention to that. I mean, I've been making a point, for example, of whenever I've thought of somebody and I thought, I wonder how they're doing. Almost, even if it's somebody who I wouldn't normally day-to-day deal with, because those people are on the same Hangouts and video conferences that I go to every day, I'm dropping them an email and saying, how are you coping? How are things going? This is like here, how are you feeling? And I think those sorts of touches within teams, and particularly by team leaders, are vital. And they're almost things that you can't sort of teach. They're not something that's going to be mandated from on high. In fact, some of the efforts that I've seen of people doing top-down management of well-being and so on have looked a bit clunky and a bit absurd. There's a list that somebody sent me of all the apps that their company had set up, and frankly, you'd spend the whole week in mindfulness apps and fitness classes and get-togethers and virtual cocktails. You try to do everything that was on that list. So I think it's those human touches within teams, and where humane team leaders are taking the initiative just to sort of touch in with people who perhaps they haven't heard from. One thing that I noted earlier and pointed out to FT colleagues was that, I was the New York bureau chief for the Financial Times in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And of course, it was an extremely busy time for journalists who were covering that story, of which I was one. And I noticed a few weeks afterwards that it was seemingly easier for the journalists who were writing about the 9/11 experience to process it. Now, I may be generalizing here, but doubtless it did have a profound effect on all of us. But the people who first said, I really need to take time off, I'm not dealing with this, or I'm upset, I'm worried about my family, or what happens if there's another attack, those people were the ones generally who had not been involved in the coverage. And so I think to some degree, every company will be different, but the analogy would be, you've probably got people in your companies who are working very hard to deal with the HR implications of this, or the supply chain implications, or who are heavily involved at board or executive committee level in dealing with the wider fallout. But there are probably a few people in your team or company who actually aren't heavily involved at all. They are kicking their heels. They may be worrying as a result, am I useful? Is there anything I should be doing? They might be kind of spinning their wheels fruitlessly and thus suffering a little bit from exhaustion because they're trying to do stuff but not being heard because they're not the key person at the meeting. We made a joke at the beginning of the crisis about, the battle to be on that mission critical list. Yeah. Are you mission critical? And particularly given the uncertainty economically, people who aren't on the mission critical list are bound to worry, I'm not on the mission critical list. Am I on the list of people who are going to survive this crisis at all?
Right.
So bearing in mind those divisions is very important for anyone who's managing a team now.
There's a couple of really good points you've made there. That it's all right, those of us who are talking about this sort of situation, who are trying to understand and manage this fascinating situation, you're suggesting it may be easier for us to be dealing with this than those people who we may think, well, we've given them a bigger screen, we've checked their broadband connections fine, they can carry on doing their job. But they may be challenging, they may be concerned about their job role and their value in a way that perhaps hasn't occurred to us.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm not a psychologist. I talked to a psychologist about this, in fact, last week, sorry. And she did point out that people who have had direct experience in traumatic situations might appear to be processing it, but in fact suffering as much as the others. So I don't want to downplay the possibility that those of us who are heavily involved are also anxious, because it is one of those rare situations, and 9/11, at least for those of us who lived in New York, was similar, when you have a combination of something that is profoundly affecting your work, but also there's wider anxiety about what happens to my family, to my future, to my finances, to my career. And those are very rare and I think quite precarious situations for managers and teams to work through.
Yeah, that's you've given us a couple of things to think about there in terms of the challenges and the traps to ensure we don't fall into. If we just sort of look at the other side of the coin, are there any particular opportunities that are being realised at the moment? What are the realisations that are being made in terms of what we're learning about ourselves and the way we work?
I mean, I think there are perhaps two elements to that. One is obviously if you like to put it crassly, the corporate opportunity. People at the top of companies will be thinking, hang on, if we can work in this way and we can manage 90% of what we do without having to all be together in the same place, then maybe we can apply some of this when we emerge from this particular crisis. And I talked to some companies that had been doing that, Domestic and General, which is they're the people who sell you the warranty on your fridge. Essentially, they had a call center that they had to move entirely online, entirely to virtual. And they were saying, the chief operating officer there was saying, it's a big opportunity for us. We can see now that we've invested in 900 new laptops for our team. That's an investment in the future. We think we can then run things much more flexibly in future. So there's that sort of top-down corporate opportunity. And then, of course, there's the personal element, which is that many of us may realize, actually, you know what? There are ways in which I work if I don't commute any longer, or if I set up in my front room with a view of the garden, or if I do a job in a different way, that I can translate back into the new normal, as people are already calling it, of post-COVID-19. And I think some of those personal productivity improvements, to put it in a rather economic sounding way, are going to be the fruit of this for people who are prepared to exploit them. I don't minimize the possibility, which I think is becoming clearer as we get further into the lockdown in the UK, certainly, that most of us will just yearn to go back to something that is more like it was before. I think in the early phases of the crisis, Emma Jacobs and I wrote a piece about, is this the future of work? Is the future of work changing? And I think to some degree it is. But in other respects, there are lots of people who will yearn to get back into an office and socialize with their colleagues again, and will be thinking to themselves, what I really miss is getting together for that morning meeting and seeing everybody face to face and not having to do it with this clunky Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever. And in fact, the little research that has been done prior to this on remote working suggests that the least productive options are when you force people directly into all to be in the office, or you force everyone all to work at home. And the most productive are when you give people a choice, because some people will work better in an office and some will work better from home or from a remote location. And once you give people the choice between those two, or even the choice to toggle between the two, which we don't have now, that's when you see the real benefits of remote working.
Which strikes back to what you said at the start, that let's not mistake what we're going through now as flexible working. It isn't.
Right.
It comes with the benefits and the risks of any fixed way of doing things.
Right.
If anything Andrew's said so far, by the way, strikes something familiar with you, feel free to either mention it in chat or put your hand up. If anything Andrew's mentioning is making you think, yeah, do you know what, I'm dealing with that one, or here's how I overcame that particular struggle, then we're very much up for hearing any other perspectives that we have on this. But that last...
Yes, thank you for that, Clive. Just to add to that, I mean, clearly I get a bit nervous when people describe me as an expert on this, because my experience is drawn from what I myself do and from talking to others, and I'd love to hear views or comments or experiences, good and bad, from people who are in the audience.
So Are there any, we've spoken there about sort of the risks, the opportunities, and all this seems to be focused so far on how we can keep doing what we usually do in these unusual circumstances. Are there any bigger, broader, more long-term opportunities that are emerging, things that may never be the same again? Are there any new business models, new opportunities that are finally being given a chance to show themselves?
I tend to be, and when it comes to innovation in general, I tend to be a bit of an incrementalist. I'm somebody who thinks things will change gradually rather than that there'll be some enormous new innovation that will change everything overnight. And although this clearly is an absolutely unprecedented situation that we're in, both for the scale and the scope, the fact that virtually most of the developed world, certainly, and much of the developing world is in lockdown of some sort or another. My sense is that this will accelerate some things that perhaps were already on their way. I feel it's still pretty early to say that it's going to bring about wrenching change in other areas. I mean, clearly the biggest and most wrenching change is going to be huge levels of unemployment beyond the COVID crisis. And that will, of course, change in terms of business models. The way in which businesses can work will have to change simply if they're to survive. Some will be able to take advantage of that by moving to systems which perhaps use fewer people and more machines to do some of the work. But when you think about it, in most cases, businesses will be able to dictate the rates that they pay people because there'll be a huge unemployment rate and great demand for jobs. And therefore, that may even slow down to some degree the introduction of some automated working. But I think in the more narrow area of the way we work, obviously we're seeing businesses like Zoom, which is handling this call, and others immediately ramping up what they can do. And a lot of the refinements that perhaps they would have taken a while to beta test and then gradually roll out are having to be brought in very swiftly. I think we're also seeing, Zoom being an example of this, that it's exposing some of the glitches in software that we can work with for remote working, both in terms of how they handle privacy and also in the kind of add-ons that we find we suddenly need. I noticed, I think I'm right about this, we use Google Hangouts at the FT. If you were doing Google Hangout for some reason, you couldn't display everybody in the call on a grid. You could only do it if you're doing a Google meeting, I think I'm right in saying. And now the add-ons that you can do for Google allow you to also show the grid for Hangouts. So, I mean, there are little things that I think are being pushed through more quickly than they might otherwise have been.
Yes.
In reflecting on the wider question of, how we work, I mean, I think it's a lot of things that we've already talked about. There will be, I think, more of a recognition that rather than my rushing into work to be there in person for the first meeting of the day, it might be better for me to Zoom into that virtually and make my trip later in the day. And there may be, frankly, for the short term or even medium term, that there is no vaccine for COVID-19, may even be safer to go in later in the day when fewer people are commuting. And it may even be, as we emerge from lockdown, obligations to stagger our work days. At the FT, we started doing that quite early on, actually, saying let's move the crucial early meetings later so that we don't force people onto crowded trains at the beginning of the outbreak. So I think there'll be lots of decisions being taken about who needs to be present. Can we give people the option? There'll be decisions, I think, that will be made about how you have people who are, as it were, understudying for key roles. One of the things that many of us will be experiencing already, hopefully not with any lasting damage, is that people are falling ill, and we're having to discover that teams may be understaffed. They may need companies may need to run with more slack than they used to in order to compensate for absences. And they may realise going forward that they actually should be doing that on a more permanent basis. I mean, if I were being very rose-tinted glasses about the future, I'd say that the drive for absolute efficiency, we must have the minimum number of people to run this safely, and we can run as lean as we like with the most just-in-time supply chain and setup that we can manage. That may change, and companies will realise there is some advantage to running a just-in-case team structure, where you have enough people to be able to cover if people are off, or if there are unexpected wrenches to the supply chain or the system. So I think all those are ways of thinking that may last beyond the end of this particular crisis.
Okay, a question has arrived on my screen from John Denton. Yeah, I think an interesting observation here. John, I've switched on your microphone. Do you want to mention your observation there to Andrew?
Yeah, just reflecting on Andrew talking about the staggering meetings and making sure that people didn't come in all at once. During the London Olympics, I was working in Canary Wharf on behalf of BP actually, and we were asked to stagger our time of travel to compensate for overcrowding on the transport system. And I always thought, considering how crowded the transport system has remained, that it would be a really useful thing for people to kind of say, well, let's, don't always have to be in the 9 till 5. But it still seems to be that for a lot of people, the mindset is it has to be 9 to 5. And I guess there's also childcare issues about when you drop children off, if you have them. But I wonder if because of this prolonged stay, that maybe more companies will start to pick up on that and introduce it.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the Olympics, because that obviously was an experience when we were all writing our remote working pieces at that point. And I'm not sure how much of it stuck, because I think once people went back, they thought, well, we'll just revert back. I mean, I do think that there is and this applies across the board, not just to the way we work now, but also in other respects. There is a sort of shadow of the way we used to work that overhangs most businesses, even as they change. And most notably, you've seen this as people have moved from the analog to the digital, that a lot of the things that we did because it was the analog way of doing things, and one of them might be the commute, although as you rightly point out, the commute also revolves around pick up and drop off at school and other elements of personal life that can't as easily be changed. But you do see in companies that have moved from analog to digital working, that actually they often retain, I mean, the newspaper business is a good example, actually, we still retain the print version of the FT, and therefore quite a lot of what we do is timed to that drop-dead deadline for the final edition of the print version of the group. So it's inevitable, I think, that you get some hangover of what's gone before. But as I said, I mean, it seems to me one of the ways out of lockdown may be staggering people's return to the office by profession, maybe, but then ultimately by when they need to be in, and running with teams, like a lot of companies are now running with a kind of an A and a B team, or red and a blue team, to avoid cross-contagion, or were running like that before the final lockdown. They may return and say, look, actually, we don't need all those people in the office at the same time, so let's make this a habit rather than something that only applies in an emergency.
Thanks for that question, John. I've got some more questions for Andrew, but there's plenty of opportunity here for you folks to come in with your questions, your observations in the time we have left. So do go for that question and answer box if you'd like to make a point, ask a question, ask Andrew for any more detail on any part of this issue, this remote working evolution, this remote working change that we're discussing today. Andrew, you've mentioned there the role of managers in considering the well-being, the technical facilities available to people, the way the working culture allows for people's mental health. If you were to give managers grappling with this situation a couple of top tips, What are the main considerations you think they should be making a note of and giving some earnest attention to?
Well, this is a difficult one. I mean, I wrote a column early on which said that some middle managers would emerge as the kind of unsung heroes of this, and it wasn't entirely a flippant point. It was partly recognising that between the top executives who are in non-stop emergency board meetings about the survival of a company and how you deal with a massive fall off in work and demand, and the team members, there's a group which is also working from home, but struggling to convey the message of the upper echelons to the team, and also that important way that I've already described, trying to maintain the well-being and the mental health and the motivation of the team. I think one important thing that I think about a lot is not assuming that everybody needs to know that there is a firm plan, because let's face it, not even our very, very top leaders know how to get out of this yet. And I mean, I would recommend to you, just as an example of leadership, it's a very, very long, being French, a very long statement, but Emmanuel Macron's address to the French citizen, his French fellow citizens yesterday, is a good example. You can probably find highlights and an English version of a leader recognizing publicly that he doesn't have all the answers and that he's working towards the answers with the people that he knows. And I think, in the academic literature, this is called sense making. And there's a lot being written about it, about how you work your way through a crisis as a leader by admitting to your team that you don't have the answers and engaging them in finding some of the solutions. So I would hope that good managers would be working with their teams to say, look, at some point when we emerge from this, how would you want to work best? What are the ways in which we can already work towards this potentially new way of working that we might have to adopt? Acknowledgement of uncertainty, rather than saying, I, as a manager, have to go back, sit in a darkened room, write a plan, and then present it as the certainty. Because frankly, that plan is going to have to change, as we've discovered over the last few weeks, probably by the day after tomorrow.
So in a way, it's a little like the things we were discussing earlier, that changes were underway, good practice already existed. Perhaps this is bringing it to the surface. And just like good leadership doesn't always involve appearing to be always in charge all the time, knowing all the answers, that's brought that particular good aspect of leadership to the fore, not pretending you know everything, involving people, being honest with people.
Yes, I think those are important elements. I certainly think the honesty point, clearly there are situations of crisis when you want to be confident in your leader. You want to be confident in the people that you feel are guiding the organization or the country or the team to the next phase. But there are also points in which it's right and proper to admit that you don't have, as a manager, all the answers. And I think that's a kind of important thing to learn. And I think another obvious point is that as somebody leading a team, you don't want to get exhausted yourself. So a certain element of self-care that I've written about a couple of times in recent weeks is also important. Recognize that your own energy is not limitless and that you don't have to then push through, do the extra hours and hours, because if you don't make it through, or you fall ill, or you decide, or you can't handle it, that's going to be bad for everybody.
I'm really pleased you've made that point. We're talking so much about what we can do as leaders, as managers for other people, but that we're finishing on this point of that we have to look after ourselves in order to look after the people in our teams. This isn't the time to play the hero, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think we've also spotted, and touching on something that Ricky's brought up in the chat room here, that the kind of remote working part, we went into this at full tilt, and a lot of people complained in the early weeks that they were suffering from a kind of overload of communication, too much video conferencing, non-stop. A friend of mine told me that he'd found that his entire electronic diary was being booked out by people who would normally have strolled over to his desk and sorted something out in 2 minutes. They were filling his diary with half-hour video slots until he eventually had to book his own lunch in order to make sure that he took a break. Those are the...
Sorry.
No, go on.
We're over formalizing this. We're over technologicalizing it. Given these new tools, perhaps we're overusing them.
Yes, and the other thing, and this was the striking thing from the evidence of the research we did 2 weeks ago, was that all these big multinationals that had had the experience of the Chinese workforce or the Italian workforce said things only really start getting difficult in the home working, the forced home working, after 4 or 5 weeks. And we're only just in the UK coming into that period. So it's as a number of people said to me, using the old cliche, it's a marathon, not a sprint when it comes to this particular element of lockdown. And people will start to get fretful, genuinely fretful and worried, probably only in the next couple of weeks. So I think it's worth bearing that in mind.
So perhaps then, to sum up, it sounds like a lot of the skills that you're suggesting we need to find and we need to grow within ourselves, they're not new, that they're skills that have always been part of good management, of good leadership, of driving digital transformation in a way that works for everyone. It's just now the magnifying glass is on them.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think a lot of these things, because it's forced working, are going to come under strain. I think we need to be careful when we emerge from this that we don't assume that some of the things we've learned here are applicable to everything that we do. There'll be some practices that we just say, you know what, doesn't really work anymore. I mean, I can't see the virtual cocktail necessarily surviving the need for us all to be, you know, when some of us can actually go and have a real cocktail, I prefer to go for a real cocktail, please, and not spend my time sitting slightly awkwardly at home with a glass of beer balanced on the edge of my laptop.
Andrew, thank you. I feel reassured. I feel that some of us who've been grappling with things and wondering if we're doing this right, or wondering if the way we're balancing the technology and the humanity, the way we're using things, it feels reassuring to get that perspective, to take advantage of the visibility you've got of all those different organisations doing things in the same way, all dealing with this situation together. I like what you said about recognising that this is not flexible working. Let's not pretend this is working utopia, because it's the opposite of that. And we mustn't get trapped into thinking this is the way things have to be forever. I really like what you said about being mindful of the fact that we're not all in the same situation. There may be colleagues of ours, clients of ours who are working in very tough, challenging home environments, whereas for some of us have the space and the technology to support that. And that sounds like something worth remembering. There was a very good operational point you made about contingency planning, about having a fresh look when this is over, about what did we learn? Were we ready with a spare team, with spare technology? Did we pare everything down to absolute just-in-time efficiency? Or did we have a little bit of leeway in our operations in order to afford that little bit of flexibility when we need it? That was useful. The idea of the rush hour being a more smoothed out, humane experience is an appealing one, isn't it? Any one of us who's got the tube into the city at around about 8 in the morning can sort of think, what if things were different? What if we brought a bit more humanity and flexibility to the way that we migrate into cities and out again? If that becomes a learning from this, that sounds good. And I really like the point you made about not pretending to have all the answers, not pretending to be in charge, in control, having our finger on every single detail. Let's acknowledge the fact that we are learning as we go, and acknowledge the wisdom and the insight that exists within the people that we work with, and the people we need to listen to. So I feel like I've learned a lot. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. I hope everyone stays well, and that they keep at least some of this human connection when we all return to our offices, if we do.